President Trump has accused Democrats of politicizing the coronavirus, while Democrats are blasting the administration's handling of the epidemic. What impact will all of this have on the 2020 race? For analysis, I am joined by Alex Vogel. He formerly served as general counsel for the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and he joins me from Washington. How do you assess Trump's handling of this so far?
Well, so far, I think the most significant piece of that has been the president's determination that this is an all-of-government response. There are obviously a number of different components of government who have direct or indirect responsibility in this area, from FEMA to the FDA to HHS. And I think that by pulling that very close, frankly as close as he can pull it, and by putting Vice President Pence at the top of that task force, I think that's a good and functional response to this. And I think they have been providing, and I hope they continue to, consistent and frequent updates and information. It's important that government does that at times like this, especially now when there's so much misinformation through social media and other things.
Yeah, you know, the former Senate Majority Leader, your boss, Bill Frist, was a great on this program so many times. He's a physician. Have you spoken to him about the coronavirus?
I have not spoken to him yet about the coronavirus response. I will say that even during his time as leader and since, response to health crises, both large and small, and pandemic response and preparedness were issues that were discussed and addressed back during his time in the Senate. Remember that anthrax and a lot of that happened. So there was a lot of work done organizationally to build the institutions of government up to a point where if they had to, they could respond to an event like this.
Well, I remember anthrax. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi described the administration's response as opaque and often chaotic. Former Vice President Joe Biden said, "We knew this was coming back as far as January. They didn't even begin to prepare testing kits." What's your response to those two critiques?
I think all political leaders, look, I understand it's a political season. We're in the middle of an extremely hotly debated presidential election, both within the Democratic Party and more broadly between the Democrats and President Trump. It is very important that all leaders, regardless of party, work diligently to separate the country's response to this from their political life and goals. This is not the time, regardless of politics, to be criticizing the response. This as an event has just begun. And what I have seen from this administration and government generally in this process has been super aggressive, very direct engagement, and a lot of transparency. One of the challenges we have here is that a lot is still not known. And as it develops, it's important we hear from government every day. I know Secretary Azar has obviously been very visible, which I think is important. And importantly, the president has been visible directly addressing these issues.
Do you think the Democrats, as President Trump has accused them, you think they're politicizing this?
Well, I don't want to say they writ large are politicizing it. There have certainly been some political overtones to some of their responses, which again, I understand the desire to do that and the difficulty of pulling back sometimes. But I think the better approach right now, especially at this early point in the process, is to focus on the problem. If you are of the opposition party, you have the opportunity, and certainly with Speaker Pelosi, the platform for oversight. I would argue the time for that is afterwards. That's the kind of after-action review that any good government does. I think for right now, we should focus on addressing the crisis. And as long as this administration is focusing on it to the degree that they are, I think that's what we should expect from them.
Is it okay to say Trump is having a Katrina moment, or is that too soon?
Well, a Katrina moment usually in this context refers to something, an external event that was mishandled by an administration. Regardless of your political stripe, I don't think it's fair to say that about this response, number one. Number two, The reality is all presidents are faced with crises that they don't anticipate, that seemingly come out of nowhere, that they have to respond to. That was true with President Obama and President Clinton and President Bush and everyone else. In that regard, this is that moment for the president where everyone was focusing on something else, and all of a sudden, events warranted that this came to the top of the list. What is important in that moment is that the president and his administration respond decisively and actively to engage. Much of the criticism that the Bush administration got around Katrina was that they refused to devote the resources and didn't seem to understand more broadly the seriousness of the situation until much later. You have seen engagement from this president, this vice president, his cabinet, and others at the highest level. So I think it's unfair to call it his Katrina moment. It is certainly fair to identify it as one of those seminal moments of his presidency.
The nosedive on Wall Street last week. Trump takes credit when it does well. Should he take some blame when it does poorly?
Whether he does or not, certainly people ascribe it to him. I haven't seen the press reports today after a 1,200-point gain, but I guess the credit's back to him again. Some of that is normal back and forth. I think just like institutional and retail investors who are smart know to not try and judge the market by any particular day. I think most of us know that the American economy is a big and slow to turn ship. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to chase the market. But certainly when you've touted the rise in the stock market and it drops, you inevitably have to answer for some of that drop as well.
You are head of the Global Business Advisory Group, and that group has offered an analysis of global supply chains. How's the coronavirus affecting that supply?
There's no doubt that supply chains across industries are being affected, not just because of China. Obviously, a lot of the focus here was on China, and as we've seen from our recent trade conversations with China, that is a critical part of the supply chain to a number of industries. The coronavirus has only heightened that focus and frankly, some of that vulnerability. What makes this situation truly unique is it's not just China. Yes, there's what's going on in Italy, there's issues in Korea. You were talking about a global disruption to supply chain brought on by a lot of these events, and only time will tell over the next days and weeks how enduring that effect is. In a way, the fact that American industry was already engaged in an effort to diversify their supply chain in response to some of that trade activity has probably made this easier than if it happened a year ago when a lot of that hadn't taken place yet.
Economist Max Wolf was with us earlier, and he said he fears the coronavirus will fuel anti-globalization. What are your thoughts?
There is certainly a temptation in moments like this to de-globalize further than we already have. One of the things that a lot of industries are keenly aware of because of things like supply chain, frankly, more aware of it than a lot of consumers, is the truly global nature of our economy. This will only further highlight that for everybody. And there's a recognition that we do live in a global economy. That doesn't have to be inconsistent with things like the president's trade policy to protect American industry and consumers. It is simply a recognition that we live in a highly mobile society and a lot of industry is premised on goods and services from all over the world.
Several provisions of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, will expire on March 15th without congressional action. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, there's certainly a lot of focus on it right now. Lindsey Graham and others have highlighted a lot of the concerns and deficiencies, and frankly, and I think to a lot of people's surprise, as the facts have come out about the FISA process over the last few years, there has been more than less concern, and I think that's a legitimate issue. Whether that can be removed from some of the politics surrounding those issues in a way that allows something to pass and some reform. But I do think there is probably bipartisan appetite at this point to look at those issues. You've heard from almost everyone in the process complaining about it, so I think it's a good time to do that.
And the president has consistently attacked FISA, hadn't he?
He has, and some of those were factual concerns about the experience that he and his campaign went through and some of the media response to that. So that definitely is served to help raise the issue.
Let's turn to politics. Is there a Democrat that I don't want to use the word fear, that has a good chance to beat the president?
It's funny. I think of this week as The Empire Strikes Back. There was all this excitement about Bernie wrapping it up and running away with this on Super Tuesday, and sure enough, here we are, and that's not at all the debate as we head in to it. There is a fairly fundamental disagreement going on within the Democratic primary about whether a more moderate candidate like a Joe Biden or someone who's, shall we say, more revolutionary in how he looks at our political system, like Bernie Sanders, would fare against President Trump. I come to this with a view that if you're going to beat somebody, you need to have all of your voters and convince some of the other person's voters to switch over to you. To me, the easiest argument in that regard is from Vice President Biden. The reality, though, is all of the youth and excitement and vigor and kind of movement enthusiasm within the party is the exact opposite direction and towards Bernie. And so you have two diametrically opposed theories about this election that are ultimately going to play out not only in the states, but it looks increasingly likely will have to play out on the floor of the convention, which is inherently messy. Political junkies talk about contested conventions all the time. It never happens. This may be the one where that gets played out for all to see.
Alex Vogel, thanks for taking the time today.
Thanks, Larry.